So let me go ahead, stop this, and voila, fam. Y'all know the vibes. Last time we linked up, we started the process of building out a React website. And while this site that you're looking at might not look like it's doing enough crazy stuff because it just kind of looks like regular HTML, trust me when I say that this site is doing some pretty interesting JavaScript behind the scenes. To see that, let's just go back to the code and review some of what we were working on last session. And then from there, we'll continue on with moving from JavaScript to React and talking about some of the most important fundamental concepts of working in React that everyone's going to need to know. Those three things being writing components, passing data into a component, and manipulating data inside of a component. So we're going to talk about those three things today. But first, let's just recap this nice little HTML site that's doing some very simple HTML for us to see, which will help us look at the JavaScript behind the scenes making this happen. So I'm just going to pull up my VS Code window for this particular HTML file and take a look and talk through what's going on in here. So last time we linked up, we were talking about how JavaScript has the capability of connecting to our HTML websites and being able to manipulate what we're seeing in HTML, both on the in the structural side, like the different elements that are there, but also in the styling side and the CSS and attributes connected to those elements. What we're looking at here is a basic HTML file, right? And if you recall from either some of the previous sessions that I've been doing, or even maybe from your own research, HTML is a markup language. It's a very simple structure. Every HTML document has a declaration that it's an HTML document, and then an HTML tag that holds all of the HTML that we would see on the actual page. The HTML that we see, the HTML document itself is contained within these two tags. So in our case, that's lines 3 to 43 is our HTML document itself. Every HTML document, like we say, has two inner children tags that make up the HTML document itself, those being the head and the body, right? So every HTML document will have at least these three tags: the HTML tag, the head, and the body. These comprise the fundamental nature of HTML. And like we talked about, writing HTML is a matter of putting elements inside of these two parent elements, inside of the head and inside of the body, right? Well, what we started doing was talking about, well, JavaScript has the ability to connect to an HTML document that it's linked to and manipulate that HTML document itself, right? We can use the document object model library in JavaScript in order to connect to an HTML document and do things like create elements, update elements, delete elements, and update the styling or attributes within an element, right? And we got our first taste of that building, vanilla JavaScript applications like tic-tac-toe or whatnot. But what we started working on last session was understanding how we could use JavaScript to manipulate elements in a easier way, in a less imperative way, in a more declarative way using React, right? So to just recap a little bit of what we did last session, let me close this out so we can just take a look at the code a little bit better and zoom out just a little bit. So we talked about what goes into creating elements in a JavaScript-based context. And it looks something like this, right? Every time you wanted to create or update an element in JavaScript, it kind of was a tedious process, right? The first thing you needed to do was find an element that you wanted to target in the HTML document. In this case, I was targeting an app, an element with the ID named app. And inside of the HTML, you can see in the body that would refer to this div right here, this kind of empty looking div right there. So what we need to do in order to update elements using JavaScript is a pretty significantly long process, right? First, we need to find a parent element, right? So in this case, it's the app. Second, we need to say, okay, well, if we're going to create a new element, well, next we got to create that element itself, right? Then we have to, if this, in the case of element like a header, right? A header is one of the elements that in HTML would contain some text, right? We also have to create the text for that header, right? Then we have to append the text into the header. So we got to actually say, hey, this header that I created is going to have this text inside of it. And we have to call a function in JavaScript to do that, right? And that gets us here where we have an element with the text inside. Then finally, we can add that complete element to our application, right? As you can see, the process of doing this takes a couple steps. And by following this process in JavaScript, we're doing what we call an imperative process of defining every step that has to happen in order for a change to occur via our code, right? Imperative programming requires you to put a lot of different steps out every single time. So if you imagine, right, if I had to use these 5 lines or so for creating one element, and I say, hey, we're going to build an app that has 1,000 elements, right? Imagine how many lines of code that is, right? I'm sure you can do that math yourself, right? It'd be a lot, right? It'd just be a lot. And it would be pretty repetitive and tedious. And I don't think any of us would have a good time. And so because of the fact that JavaScript developers like myself are lazy, no, I'm just kidding. Because of the fact that we always are looking for optimizing strategies, you know, ways to work more efficiently, I should say. JavaScript engineers across the board are always looking to find new ways to use JavaScript to make the work easier, right? And one of the things that some engineers at Facebook developed to do that was the React library. And we started talking about the React library, right? The React library itself, you can find React.js. I think it's React.dev now. My bad. I'm sorry. They just changed this website. But at the React.dev website, you can learn a lot more about React as a library and some of what it offers. But the most important thing you need to know is that React is a library that allows for you to build user interfaces for your websites in JavaScript. So you can leverage JavaScript to be a programming language where you can declaratively state, hey, I want to create a website that will have these components and build the JavaScript in order to use the React library to make JavaScript that will allow for those components to exist. Today, we're going to dive way deeper into what I mean by a component. But for now, think about a component as just the different sections of a website. So for instance, if you think about it, particularly like with this kind of basic looking site I have here, a component might be this top section that has our little title or whatnot, right? Another component might be these paragraphs that I have here, right? Just different sections. If we were to go to an actual site, like maybe even like this React, the React library site, right? We can actually see components in a lot of different capacities here, right? Like here we have this like nice search bar, right? We have another little block of code that has like some tabs in it, right? We have a little hero section and the hero section with an image, etc. And then maybe another section with these buttons, right? Sorry for these really crazy looking lines, but hopefully you get the point, right? All over this website, there are different sections, different elements that are helping us achieve different things related to what our site is doing. And so the idea with React is instead of having to imperatively declare all of these elements and all of the code inside of them, we can, instead of imperatively doing it, we can do it easier by leveraging some JavaScript libraries. And that's exactly what we did to build this current site that we have here, right? We leveraged a couple of libraries and packages in order to take what was a 5-step process and turn it into a 1-line process, right? What we were doing was similarly, we were targeting a specific section in our HTML. We were still targeting our app, right? But instead of having to declare 5 things to create and update our component, we were able to use the React DOM render function in order to render some content into the app. So if you take a look, this line right here that I'm highlighting on line 18, there's a couple things going on. First of all, and I'll delete some of this stuff so it's easier to see. First thing is we were calling a particular function, right? This function is called React DOM.render. And the render function is a function built into the React DOM library. We brought the React DOM library in here using this script that we added to our HTML code. Every script that you see, external package script like this, has a plethora of different functions and classes and methods that you can call in order to leverage that script in your HTML code. And so when you see us adding these, what we call packages, what we're getting in relationship to those packages is a helpful set of JavaScript functions and library methods that are going to make our job in our life a lot easier. One of those methods clearly is the React DOM render function, which is going to help us to render new elements into our HTML, right? So that's step one, right? Calling this particular function. Step two is you can see that there is a particular bit of code that is looking like HTML that is passed into this method. There's two things passed into this method. This like long string of code that I could actually simplify a lot more by just, let's just leave it at this paragraph for now, right? This very, like this, some code looking stuff right here related to like what we might expect to see on the screen, and then a comma, and then the app, right? So clearly this function is taking in two parameters. One parameter being something that we want to show on the screen, and then the second being where is this going to be rendered? Where inside of what component are we rendering this, right? So what we see on the left-hand side, let's just dive into this a little bit deeper, right? Clearly right now inside of this, at this point in the code that we're looking at in this HTML document, we're actually inside of a script tag, right? So you can see that here on lines 15 to 19, we're in a script tag. Because we're inside of a script tag, right? Remember, script tags are used in HTML for us to write JavaScript, right? So everything in between a script tag needs to be valid JavaScript. And this looking syntax, right, doesn't really look like JavaScript, right? If anything, it looks more like this HTML that we're writing, right? And the reality is that this, what we're seeing here on this left-hand side of this functions arguments is not actually HTML. It's actually a specific JavaScript syntax that we use in React-based applications in order to define visual elements in JavaScript. So you can think about it like it's a JavaScript version of the elements that we would normally want to see in HTML, right? We call this JSX. And JSX is just a JavaScript syntax for marking up these particular types of elements. What's cool about React is it took all of the HTML elements that we're used to writing, any HTML element that you're used to writing, right? You can write that same element as JSX. So a paragraph tag in HTML would represent a paragraph, and a paragraph would just be a block of text that I would expect to see on my screen, right? Well, in JSX, the P tag also refers to a paragraph, but it would be a paragraph in JSX in JavaScript. All this allows us to do is call this syntax inside of our JavaScript tag. So instead of it being like, hey, this is an error, I don't know anything about what this funky looking syntax is, we can actually use this same syntax in order to place elements inside of our HTML. So if I save this now, you can see that this will change just to our paragraph, right? And to make that paragraph a little bit more easy to see, I'm actually gonna change this into an H1. And again, these aren't HTML tags. These are now JavaScript tags that are gonna convert this JavaScript into HTML. So turning that back into a H1. Quick pause. If this makes sense to you, just give me a thumbs up real quick. You know what I'm saying? Like, I know it's kind of interesting working with React, but this is one of the things that makes it super interesting is that we can still use what we're used to working with in HTML, but technically speaking, all of this is JavaScript for a necessary reason that it's inside of a script tag. Cool. Thanks for y'all. Thanks for those acknowledgements. So cool. So basically, all we need to know is in order to render components in React, we need to define where we're going to render them. So we need at least one place inside of an HTML document where we can render it. And typically what you'll see is that we'll keep a div, an empty div like this, where our JavaScript and the React code will be rendered into that space. So that is typically going to be common practice. Like, hey, we have some empty div, and inside of that empty div is where we're going to actually tell the React code base, here's where I want you to insert that bit of code. Then we just define the JSX that we want to see. And JSX, like I said, can comprise of all the visual elements that we're used to working with in HTML. And we take that JSX and say, hey, render this JSX into that particular element that we targeted before. And that's how the React DOM render method works. It renders some JSX into a particular HTML element on our screen. So cool. Here's where we're gonna go. So now that we understand how to render some JSX, right? And if you think back to kind of what I had here before, all I did was I actually just created just more JSX, right? And there's two things I want to share with y'all here. The first being, let's say I did want to just have a lot of different elements inside of here. Clearly I can, if I save this, right? Clearly I can have as much JSX elements inside of that function statement, and it will return, right, if it's valid. But let me show you one thing that kind of gets a little funky here, right? Let's say I made a mistake, and maybe like I put this paragraph outside of this div here, right? So put it kind of here, right? Well, technically, if this was HTML, let me just copy this out and put it as if it was regular HTML so you can see what I'm talking about, right? Technically here, I have a div, and inside of the div, I have a couple elements, and then outside of the div, I have this paragraph, right? If this was HTML, right, this would be pretty valid, right? Like HTML wouldn't be mad at this. It'd be like, okay, you have a div and some text inside of it, and then you have some text underneath it. Matter of fact, I can show you that HTML won't be mad at this by, let me just comment out this React script right now. And let's pretend we're just working with HTML, right? These scripts don't necessarily show anything, so we can keep those there. But let's pretend we're just keeping these this valid HTML right here, right? Matter of fact, I'll comment this out so the example is a little bit more straightforward, right? So this is now just a regular HTML document. Hopefully y'all see what I'm saying, right? Give me a quick thumbs up if you see what I mean, right? We're just putting in HTML. We have a new div with some H1s and paragraphs and paragraph here, right? And like I said, the JSX syntax is literally looks just like HTML, so it was easy to just copy this back here. But yeah, so if I save this, right, we will still see everything that was there before, right? This wasn't a problem in an HTML context. Like it doesn't matter how you structure the HTML so long as things close appropriately. But now let's go back to how it was with the React in the React context, right? So just get rid of this up here and go back to kind of rendering it in React, right? Well, let's say I had that literal same flow of like a div with some text inside of it, right? You can see with this highlight, there's a div, there's a div, and inside of the div, clearly there's an H1, and then there's a paragraph, right? And then after the div, we have another paragraph, right? Well, I'm gonna save this now and go back to our HTML, and well, what happened, right? Everything kind of disappeared, and there's no real clarity on like, where's my stuff, right? Well, this gets into an interesting thing about how the JavaScript with React is getting compiled. If we take a look at the inspector, you can see that we're actually getting an error right now, right? Uncaught syntax error. It says inline Babel script, adjacent JSX elements must be wrapped in an enclosing tag. Did you want a JSX fragment or, essentially it's saying here that what's going on is that we can't have in the JavaScript version of this code, right? Now that we're in JavaScript, this is no longer HTML. This is JSX, it's JavaScript. And basically we're getting an error in the JavaScript that says, hey, you can't have like a floating JSX element, right? And for y'all, that might be a little confusing. Like, well, what does that mean? Well, in JSX, in the syntax of JSX, it's always important for all elements to be contained within a wrapping element or in an element that can contain, that has the ability to have a HTML inside of it, right? What does that mean for y'all, right? Well, that means that we want to keep this div around all of this text. Like we wouldn't want this paragraph to be outside of the div because divs are great elements at wrapping things. And if I put this back here now, you can see that we'll get back our little code because the div is actually wrapping all of these elements, right? It's a kind of tricky thing, but I use it to illustrate the point that this is no longer HTML. This is JavaScript. So there will be certain quirky things about the JavaScript syntax that will make or break our code. Whereas before, HTML just let us see everything. Now we're working with JavaScript. So we're gonna wanna make sure that we have proper syntax for how to write these JSX elements so that we don't actually we don't actually have as many errors when we're working with these this JSX and at scale, right? Because clearly now that I'm adding more elements, it might be the case that because I'm working with more elements than just one, things might get a little tricky. So because of that, right? Because of the fact that it gets a little tricky once you're starting to return JSX in a long format, right? JSX that has a lot of different elements inside of it. This becomes a starting point for how we use the React library and syntax specific to the React library in order to make our code a lot more readable and easier to pass JSX that has a lot of different JSX going on, a lot of elements inside of it, I should say. And that brings us to what we're talking about today, which is, sorry, I'm ahead of myself, which is, oh my God, the React core concepts, components, props, and state, right? So these are the three things we're going to talk about today. The first being components, right? And the component is essentially the solution to this little issue that we are just talking about, right? Well, if I want to pass an element that contains some more than just one element, more than just one HTML-like element, I want an easy way to pass a reference to these JSX elements into this render method, right? It kind of gets a little funky putting all these things all in one place like this. It's hard to read. It's not easy for any of us to see, right? So we're going to look for ways to actually streamline this, to make it so that, hey, instead of me passing 6 different pieces of elements inside of this render method, I would rather pass one thing that references all of that, right? And that one thing is what we call a component in React, right? So components are a way for us to pass groups of JSX elements together as one item or one object, right, in the JavaScript land. And that's exactly what makes components so cool and so important in the aspect of building out our UI, our user interfaces, right? So going back to what I was saying earlier about how websites are created and how modern websites are structured, components are going to allow for you to build self-contained reusable snippets of code, which is great. They kind of are an easy way for us to pass references to different code that we're creating in JSX. It says if you think of components as Lego bricks, you can take these individual bricks and combine them together to form larger structures. If you need to update a piece of the UI, you can update that specific component or brick, right? What they're getting at here is that components become kind of the basic building block of your website, right? Because if you think about it, right, technically speaking, what I'm doing here is I'm creating one big group of JSX elements. And what they're saying a component is a component would allow us to mark this particular group of elements as one item or object that we can reference, right? That's what a component is. It's like the ability for us to group different pieces of JSX and turn that JSX into some type of an object that we can pass around, right? And we can use more specifically to make our code a lot easier to build upon. So, so let's talk a little bit about that. How do we actually make these components, and how do we use them in React in order to build out kind of the logic of our sites a lot more simply in the JSX sense, right? So creating components is a very simple process in React. All you need to know how to do is write a JavaScript function, right? So we talked about functions, and functions are an essential part of most every programming language, right? We use functions in programming languages to return some value at the end of a function, right? Functions also just perform manipulation on some data. Well, a function in JavaScript is fairly simple to write. There's two ways to write functions. One way is to use this function keyword, create the name of the function, and inside of the curly braces, we define what we're gonna do, right? In the case of any function that we're creating in React that we want to make a component, we will use this function in order to return the JSX that we want that component to hold. So a component is a function that returns UI elements. So inside of a return statement of a function, you can write some JSX. So here's an example of us doing that right here, right? So let's go ahead and do that and take this pretty gnarly piece of JSX code that I wrote and turn it into a function. So first thing I want to do is define a function, right? So I'm just going to leave a comment here, define a function, right? So what's interesting here is that there's two ways for us to define a function. One way is to just use the function keyword and create a name of a function. So I'll say, let's say welcome, right? And open some curly braces and some parentheses in order to define, or let's say return some JSX, right? So let me say to make a component, we need to define a function, right? So here I just need to return some JSX. So I'll just return and open some parentheses, and inside of here, I can return the JSX that I want my code, my component to be responsible for. So in this case, I'll take this big lump of code and I'll say, okay, cool. I'll just clean it up a little bit for myself and for y'all to more easily see now that I can do this, right? And here we have kind of a component being returned, right? There's a div, and inside of the div, we have all of this stuff. So I'm going to change it up now, and I'm going to say, well, you're looking at my first component. Yep, I'll keep this and let's go. Word. So that's step one, is defining a function, right? Step two in creating components and passing components in React is to actually pass that function as the first argument in our render method. So where we were previously just returning all the JSX, now we can actually return that particular function that we wrote. So what I'll do here is inside of this render method, I will call the function that we wrote. And here's where things get a little more interesting, right? So go ahead and go back to our site. Okay, well, oops, everything's white. I guess that means there's an error. Let me check. And here we go, right? Functions are not valid as a React child. This may happen if you return a component instead of component from render. Or maybe you meant to call this function rather than return. Well, this warning and this error is seemingly confusing if you don't really understand what components, how to write a component in React, right? Step one is creating the function. And then step two is calling the function like so, as an element instead of just with the name of the particular function. And that's actually what in the next tutorial it says here. It's like, oh, hey, wait a second. Sorry, I told you the wrong thing. You got to actually return it as an element instead of as just the name of the function. So let's go ahead and make that change, right? So instead of whenever we define a function that is going to be a component, right? So we're creating a component Clearly, this component is given the name welcome. In order to render it properly in React, we have to make this component, this function name component, basically a component tag. And to do that, we just wrap it in the little angle brackets that we're used to. And what's interesting about components are two things. There's two things you got to keep in mind when you're rendering components and writing components of your own. The first thing is that you should always capitalize the first letter of a component. You'll see that this is a common pattern in React, but it's also done intentionally, right? You can't have components with lowercase letters because a lot of the elements, the regular JSX elements, have lowercase letters. So sometimes it actually will create a conflict if you start trying to, like, let's say I want to create a new component and I accidentally call it P. Well, there's already a P JSX element, right? So without capitalizing it, there's no way for me to differentiate my component from the built-in JSX elements that already exist. So that's rule number one. Always capitalize the name of your component. The second thing is remember that you call a component with this JSX syntax as well, right? So once you define the function, it's important for you to actually call the component using this kind of angle bracket syntax, right? And so here we can see this resembles kind of a self-closing tag in HTML. And that's how components get called typically, if the component doesn't have any, doesn't wrap over any other elements, which for the most part, when you write your components, they'll self-close like this. But when you work with a little bit more intermediate or advanced components, you might actually have a component that, a component that takes some other data in and then closes like so, right? If your component's not taking data in, like other JSX data in, right, then you will just self-close it like so. So by doing this, now we can go back to our code here, and then voila, there you go. You can see my first component right here, right? So how do we do this? Step one, we wrote a function, and that function returned some JSX. So a component function will always return some JSX. And then we called that function inside of our render method as a component. We said, hey, this is a new component that I'm rendering in the app. And that is what allows us to actually see this component on the screen. Give me a quick thumbs up if you're following. If not, drop something in the chat, you know what I'm saying? Your feedback is my desire. Cool. I got a couple of folks with their thumb up. Thank y'all. Great. And if not, please drop it in the chat. You know what I'm saying? Your boy is here to answer your questions for sure. But this is our first component. You know what I'm saying? We're lit right now. Like, this is the first building block. One of the first big building blocks to working with React is understanding components and being able to write components. So let's keep hacking at this and look at some more ways that we can use components and manipulate data with React inside of components. So cool. Next thing we want to know is that, hey, well, components are always going to be how we structure our React applications, right? One thing that's important to know is that you can create nested components. So you can create one component. So in this case, right? Here we have this component for a header, and then in this we have a second component for a home page, right? And it is possible for you to nest those two components together. So for instance, let's say we want a homepage component, and that homepage component might have a couple different elements inside of it. One being a header, right? Well, inside of the homepage component, I can return not only the regular JSX elements I'm used to, but also the component that a custom component that I create as well, right? So in this case, this is my header, right? And it says develop preview ship. By calling it and returning it inside of this function, when I finally render this, function itself, right, I will be able to see all that code. And This example actually is kind of funny because unless they do it down here, let's see. Oh yeah, they did. They switched it. But basically, right? If I want to nest this element, right, I can say, okay, cool. I have a component called a home page, and inside of that home page, I have a div with a header, right? Well, I'm gonna want to render then the home page instead of the header because that will allow for me to have that component that is returning the nested component inside of it, right? Um, so um, so yeah, one thing that's pretty common is the fact that you might have components nesting other components, right? And so on our side, let's just do another quick example, right? That would be the same as if inside of the welcome component, right? Instead of having this div here as like its own big block, I might create another component. So maybe I'll create one more functional component and I'll say message, right? And the message, again, remember I create a function, right? And keep a capital letter for the component. And I got to return some JSX, right? Return. Oops, all component functions return some JSX, right? So here I might want to say, okay, well, let me just take this this big block of oops, let me take this big message here, maybe this top message here, and return that instead, right? So now the message, right? If we go back to my particular code, right? This big head top message, instead of having that big top message just kind of declared in the welcome, I might actually have another component that represents that particular part of my code. And then because I have defined now this message, I can actually call this as a component just like so. Oops, just like so, right? And so because right now the app is still rendering my welcome component, the welcome component, right, will come in here and it says, okay, return a div, return this message component, and then return our two paragraphs, right? And the message component was defined above here. So it'll say, oh, okay, the message component is actually referring to this function right here, and we're gonna return this H1. So I'm gonna say you're looking at my second component here, and then keep the message there. So hopefully we'll see this update, right? And we say, you're looking at my second component. So this is a very redacted version of something that becomes very important when you're building out these websites. To get back into the groove of like what I'm talking about here, let's just remember, take a look at a common website today, like this React homepage, right? Well, in the chat, I want you to try to label like, what might you consider if you were building this site again, knowing what we now know about components and how they structured these elements on the screen, what might you turn into components from this particular landing page, right? What might be some of the sections that you would create on this? If you were to rebuild this, somebody's like, yo, I'll give you $100,000 to rebuild this, this website, right? And they're like, but in order to get it, you got to define the components you'd use to make this site up, right? What might be some things that you turn into components here from what you're seeing right here? Nav bar, the header, the buttons. Yeah, those are all great. Those are all great. The footer, yeah, image. Yeah, these might all be, and here's the thing. There's no right or wrong definition of what the components are, so long as you define the user interface in a way that makes sense, right? So, and what I mean by make sense means really just that it shows what it needs to show, right? So some of y'all said the nav bar, right? Ooh, wow, please ignore how crazy ugly that line was just now. Wow, I am embarrassed at how ugly that line was. I wish I didn't even attempt to draw that in front of y'all right now. But let's say none of that line is this box, you know what I'm saying? This might be a component, right? This nav bar. But like some folks just said, well, inside of that nav bar, you might have another component that is, I'm sorry, I didn't see this little, there's more to our nav bar here, right? But we have other things that might be part of this, other components that we might put inside of here, right? So one might be, oops, one might be a, this like search bar, right? This search bar could be its own component, right? And just like that search bar, we might have a component that represents just these like kind of buttons floating here, right? All of these are contained inside of the nav bar, but they're their own elements, right? So technically we might keep those as their own, what we might consider their own components. Sorry, I gotta move this thing from Zoom. It's tweaking on me right quick. Right, and then if you think about it, like there, also on this page, we see a couple other elements that we haven't talked about yet, right? So some folks say, hey, well, there's this image here, and maybe this whole hero section is a section of our site, right? Again, there's no right or wrong way. It just will depend on what are all the visual elements that you're gonna see, right? And inside of this header, whoops, sorry. Inside of this header, we might see, okay, cool. Like there's this like top section that has an image, and there's also this other piece of text, right? That is important for us to see as well, right? Maybe it's like, maybe we put both of the text together, right? And then lastly, we might say, okay, well, there's also these buttons, right? And we want to keep note of these buttons, right? So this one website might have a plethora of different components depending on how you actually structure it. But give me a thumbs up if you see what I'm doing here, right? I'm just essentially breaking down what I'm seeing visually into kind of the overarching landscape of elements that are on that particular page, right? And what this allows me to do is say, okay, let me take a website and turn it into its visual elements, right? And take those visual elements and create components that will be responsible for showing those elements, right? So in the case of an app like this, right, without trying to go too deep in the code, like let's say I'm gonna pseudocode this in the little app that we have so far. Let's see, I can do this. If I go back to my code base, ooh, well, that's not going to be easy to see. Well, let's do this. Let me do this for y'all so that we can come back to this. I'm going to screenshot this draw, open this draw real quick, close this, and then go back here, right? Well, in the case of that little app that we just saw, right? Here, and let me pull it up so that we can see that one more time. Oops. Oh, wait 1 second, fam, my bad. This thing is tweaking on me. Let me pull up that screenshot we just took so we can look at it. All right, great, gravy. Right, so here's that little screenshot, right? In a case like an app like this, right? Well, I might want to make it so that if I were trying to rebuild this app in React, right? Well, let's look at it like this. Well, there's one big app window, right? And inside of that window, I have like maybe two big components. One being kind of this nav bar looking thing, this orange line, and one being maybe this yellow box for all of the kind of inside elements, right? Well, I can do that pretty simply, right? Let's say instead of kind of this function with the message and the welcome and stuff, like I might, let me just comment this all out real quick, or I don't know, commenting it out don't look like, oh, let's just do this. Let's just make a good script. So to do something like this, right? Well, first things first, I'm gonna still need to target. I'm gonna still need to target the element, the app, right? Our little div that's empty. Because remember, the React library needs us to have some empty place where we're gonna insert our React code. But to rebuild kind of this little website itself, right? I might say, okay, well, I'm gonna have one component and let's call it a nav bar, right? And that nav bar is going to return some JSX, right? For now, just for the sake of kind of mocking it up, right? Let's say that I have a little div, and if I look at it, right, looks like there's a couple different elements inside of it. There's this image, there's this blue search bar, and there's green items here that represent kind of these buttons. Well, here I could very easily kind of, let's just say I'm mocking it up, right? I'll put an image in here, and remember, like, an image would have a source, right? And I'd have to kind of pass a source in here at some point. What else is in here? This little search bar, right? So that might be an input, and the input is also an element that has a type attribute. So I might have to pass something here, right? And what else is in here? We have this kind of list of buttons, right? So there's a couple different ways you could do the buttons or those little pieces of text. But for now, let's just say I put a couple spans with the names of each of these things, right? So I could have one that's like learn, you know, learn, and whatever the rest are, right? And I'll just say dot dot dot. Right, so hopefully you're seeing, right? I'm just now taking the elements that are inside of this orange box and trying to turn this into a component that would show these things, right? Similarly, I might have another component, right? That would be my hero section or something, right? And the hero section clearly is another image, a big piece of text, two big pieces of text, and two buttons, right? Well, again, if I were to start mocking this up as a component, right? Well, again, components have to have some kind of wrapping element. So I like to use divs. Sometimes you'll see people use other components to wrap. But for now, just use the div, it'll be easier for you. But in this section, the div would represent this yellow box, right? The div is this yellow box that holds these other three boxes. So in this case, the three boxes that I would have would be, one would be another image, right? And remember, an image takes in a source. So I'll pass a source there at some point. Another thing would be this box with the text inside. So I could represent the text a couple different ways, but let's say I do an H1 that says React, right? H close to H1, and then another maybe H2, the library for web and native user interfaces. Right? H2, the library, native user interfaces, right? And then clearly I have this section with some buttons, right? So maybe I have another div, and inside of these divs, I have a couple button elements, right? I don't remember what the buttons say, y'all, but you know what I'm saying? Hopefully you get the gist, right? I could put my two buttons here, close this div, and boom, now I have another component, this hero section. Of course, the reason I'm not going to run this is because it's not styled at all. There's still things I'm missing, like the source for the image, etc. Right? But if I had passed in a URL for this image, if I had added some CSS to these different sections, which we'll talk about in a bit, hopefully you can see that. If now I say, okay, well, boom, instead of rendering all of these things in one, maybe I can have one component that's like landing page, right? And the landing page will return just a super simple div. Whoops. And it can call our nav bar, and it can call our hero section, right? So and then here I can just render the landing page. Right? In this way, I'm creating the React based on what I want to see visually, right? So give me a quick thumbs up if you see what I'm talking about here with like how I use this pseudocode for these sections. Clearly, like I said, there's a couple little more steps I'd have to do to make this runnable, but hopefully you get the point, right? I have a couple different components that are meant to represent these visual elements that I'm seeing here. And those visual elements will eventually be passed into the render of the React DOM. And that's how React code and writing components typically works, right? Is we start off with thinking about what are the components we would want to see to build something. And then you try your best to write the JSX elements that will relate to that particular thing, right? So in this regard, this would help us do that, right? Cool. So let's go back to a more simpler times when everything was so simple. And we'll come back to making this JSX that I just wrote mirror the React website. But first, let's just finish up. Let's just finish up what we were doing with this welcome section first. Cool. So save this, go back here. It should still show up. Thank you. And boom. So let's keep going and talking about these components. So in this regard, right, it's pretty, hopefully you see, right, we can create components and nest those components, right? If I have a header component, I can call it inside of another component. And that is a pretty big deal when it comes to React. The other thing is this, right? Let's say I want to make this component more reusable, right? Well, to make this reusable, if we look back at how this message and welcome component is structured, right? Right now, it's not really easy to see how, well, right now this message component is returning just one thing, right? But let's say I'm starting to create a new app, and I'm like, okay, this app is going to be called WhatsApp, you know what I'm saying? And WhatsApp is going to have a bunch of messages, right? So instead of just one message, it might have a couple different messages, right? Well, if I save this and rerun this, I'm just going to have a bunch of the same thing running over and over. And that's great about how components work, in that we can use them over and over. We can reuse components. But what if I want these messages to be unique, right? And instead of H1s, like maybe I actually return little paragraphs, so it's a little easier to read, right? Well, this is cool, but it would be great if there's a way for me to personalize each message, right? And that's exactly what we can do with a concept in React that we call props. Props are a way for us to pass data between components. Quick pop quiz right here. How would you nest a header component inside a layout component in React? What do y'all think, A, B, or C? How would we nest a header component inside a layout component based on these three answers here? Pause for commercial break. Y'all ain't gonna help me and drop it in the chat. Thanks, bro. I appreciate you. Thanks, Nora. You know what I'm saying? You a real one. You know what I'm saying? I don't know. Everybody be fake. You know what I'm saying? I be trying my best out here. Everybody want to go and give you answers. Man, shout out my girl Nora. You know what I'm saying? Hold me down. Right. Exactly. So let's go to the props and what we do to create data, pass data with props. Right. Well, clearly, right, we have a message component, and the message component is being called multiple times. But what if we want to actually make it so that this message could receive some data? So I could say, hey, this message is gonna have some content, and the content is gonna be something like, hey, message one, or hey, this is message one, right? And then maybe this one has some content, and it's like, hey, this is message two, right? Like, how could I define kind of some content or define some data that this particular component can use? Well, it turns out that we can do just that with props. Props are essentially a way for us to pass data into a component. And why might we want to do this? Well, let's say we have a button in our code. Instead of having to create 3 different customized components for buttons, we can pass some data to each button that says something like, hey, what type of a button am I? Am I primary, secondary, or disabled? Which will allow us to reuse the code, but just change things based on the information that the component gets passed. So we can actually do this in JavaScript using a concept called props. So in this, just like I was just doing, right? We're now able to, we can pass and define props with any variable name that you might think of. So in the case of me saying, hey, every message might have some content, well, defining props is that simple. I can say, hey, this component is going to have a prop called content, and content is going to be equal to this piece of data, right? All I need to do in order to make that work is make it so that this function receives the props. And so what I do is I pass props as an argument into the particular component function. With the argument for props being called to essentially to get the data out of the props, remember that you will name your prop something when you're declaring your component. So in this case, when I declared this message, I said, hey, I want to give it a piece of data called content. Inside of the message component's definition, when I use props, I need to make sure I call the prop that was used inside of the when it was called. So clearly there's a prop called content that I just created. So here I can call actually props.content in order to get a reference to that particular piece of prop that was passed on into these messages. So if I give all of these messages kind of, hey, this is message 3, and hey, this is message 4, right? Essentially what I'm saying here is, okay, I have a component, it's called welcome. Welcome is going to have multiple message components. I already had defined the message component up here. But what I'm saying now is, hey, when the message component is being created in the welcome component, it's also going to receive some data. The data is called content in this case. And the content is going to be set to a string with some different messages inside of it, right? All I need to do, what we're doing right here is called creating a prop. We use this syntax to create props. And I can create as many props as I want. If I want another prop called prop2, I can create another prop called prop2 and say, hey, you know what I'm saying, like, or whatever I want to do here. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the types of data that we can pass in a prop. But writing a prop is as simple as, you know, some prop name and setting it equal to some data, right? So you can name the prop whatever you want, but you pass it to, you set it equal to some JavaScript data. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about what types of data and stuff like that in a second. But for now, let's just take a look at our message component where I passed in this prop called content. To make use of the prop and any other component, right? So I defined the component with the prop here, but inside of its declaration, I'm going to need to actually say, hey, this component is going to receive some props. And it's just as simple as typing the word props inside of the parentheses for the component that you're building. And then I can call the prop. And calling the prop uses a very interesting syntax that is going to be very important for you to familiarize yourself with. In JSX, remember, any of this little HTML looking like stuff is JavaScript, is JSX. If I want to pass data in between some JSX tags, in order to pass data into JSX, period, JavaScript data, I have to wrap the data with a curly brace. So this is going to become a very common syntax that you're going to see when we're working on these components, is that, hey, you know, if I want to pass some JavaScript data, a variable, a function, a conditional statement, whatever I want to pass, I have to wrap it in these curly braces. So here clearly, right, remember the paragraph, the message went from some static message, right? And if I save this, you'll see that you know, all of these components are going to have the same static message. instead of having some static message, right, I might say, hey, I want to pass some JavaScript data. And matter of fact, the data will be one of the props that I received. In order to get that data, the first thing I got to do is wrap it in curly braces. And then because I'm using props, I'm going to use the word props here. Remember, props, this is a keyword that you have to call. It's called props, so you have to call it props. But then you call whatever the name of the prop was that you actually passed in. So in this case, it was content. So I'm going to say props.content. And when I do this, now all of these messages are going to actually dynamically receive the data that I passed into them, right? So, hey, this is message 1, this is message 2, this is message 3, this is message 4, right? That might not seem as unique, you know what I'm saying? But I could go ahead and just change this up to be more like a thread, like yo, what's up? It's like, I'm good. How about you? Then teaching. Ooh, then teaching some React. That's lit. You the best. I'm giving myself some affirmations, y'all. Look at that, right? But see, now it's a little bit more dynamic, right? They don't actually seem like, okay, well, was there a little issue that made that the case? But now because I'm passing in a prop and because this component, the message component is expecting me to use a prop, right? That message will be dynamic, right? So if I make a new message and pass it some content, it'll also receive that dynamic prop itself. So I say, oops, close it. And boom, right? So props are a great way for us to pass data into our components. And you might now be wondering, well, what kind of data can we pass as a prop, right? Well, clearly here, and it's a little hard to see because we're still doing this all in HTML. In a bit, we'll change from doing this inside of an HTML file. But right now you can see that like this JavaScript, right, we're passing a string, right? And that string is being counted as props. So clearly we can pass strings, but with props, you can pass any other JavaScript data that you want. So you can pass a prop for a number, right? So let's just say message number equals, and in the case of things like numbers, strings are kind of rare because you can just use the quotation marks, but sometimes you'll see people actually wrap the string in curly braces too, because it's just kind of keeps things consistent. The idea is that with the prop as well, you will still use the curly braces to pass certain types of JavaScript data, unless you're declaring a string, which is, like I said, a little bit different. The number, right? So let's say I wanted to give all these messages a number, right? Well, okay, I can give it a number like 1. And here I could say, hey, this is gonna get a number 2, right? And then to make my life easier, just copy and paste. Right? So now all these messages also have a number, right? Well, that's cool because now that I defined a number prop, well, now I can come back here and say, hey, you know, this is going to be a paragraph, but it's going to have props.content, and maybe it'll also have, because this is a paragraph, remember paragraphs are like long strings of text, right? So I could say something like message, and then in here I could pass props.number and then pass props.content. So this is a really interesting little JavaScript string, but because I have a prop for each of these pieces, it'll show up the right way, right? So formatted as a little paragraph. So clearly you can pass numbers, right? In addition to this, you can pass Boolean values, you can pass functions, you can pass all the JavaScript elements you're used to writing, functions, Boolean values, numbers, strings, what else am I missing? Arrays, objects. You can pass all of those things in as data to a particular component as props. So if this was to receive, let's say this was receiving maybe reactions as another piece of data, right? The reactions itself might actually be an array of like, you know, I don't know, like or whatever, like lab, whatever, dot, dot, dot. You know what I'm saying? So in this case, I'm passing in an array as a particular prop. I don't know how I might use that yet, but hopefully you see, okay, I can pass an array. And then also I can pass like a user, or sender maybe as another piece of prop. And this might be an object. So right, the sender might have a name, and it might be like Cam, and then it might have user ID. If this is WhatsApp, might have like my number, whatever. I'm just typing random stuff. Don't call me. That's not my number. And it could have other stuff in there too. But this is an example of a component that is receiving a lot of different props. What's cool about it is if I save this, right, since this is all kind of valid JavaScript, should still show up the right way, which is fine. I'm making the point though that one component might have a lot of different props defined on it. So long as it's not being called in the render of that particular return statement of that particular component, you won't see it, right? So on the one hand, a component can receive a lot of props and not use them, but then on the other hand, if you have a component that's returning a very specific kind of syntax using specific props, if, for instance, that prop doesn't exist, so let's take out content from that last message, right? Well, we're not going to actually see that thing render at all, right? So in this case, message 5 shows up because we have in the message and a number, right? But it doesn't have content. So it didn't give us an error. It didn't stop us from seeing the page, but it doesn't render this component all the way, right? That's another tricky thing about props, is that props, if one component receives them and another doesn't, it won't necessarily, in most cases, it won't necessarily block your application. There are some cases where, especially if prop is an array like this one, and you're referencing an array in your code here, you might get an error that's like, hey, can't find this particular prop, or this prop doesn't exist. Can't read this property because it doesn't exist. The idea though between props is that the fundamental idea behind props though, and this is all I need you to take away, is that with props, we can pass data into a component, right? I'm gonna say that again. With props, we can pass data into a component. The only way, I'll repeat this, the only way that we can pass data into a component is with props, right? So if you're ever thinking, man, I wish this component got the data from this other component, I got to use props. There's no way around it. The way that you pass data into a component is you use props, right? And you can have clearly as many props as you want to find. You can pass as many props as you want. But the only way for you to pass data into a component is to use props. So that's props. So we talked about components, we talked about props. This tutorial would go through the same thing and talking a little bit more about how it does this. Talk about the curly braces and how we got to use the curly braces to show the data in JavaScript. And it even shows you a couple more JavaScript expressions that I didn't show you, right? So if we're calling a prop itself, we kind of use the curly braces, props, and then the name of the prop. If you're creating a string, you can take the data from a prop. So instead of calling props as a whole object, you can destructure what we call destructuring it, and say, hey, instead of getting back this whole props and then having to call props.title, I'm just gonna call the title. So I'm gonna create an object and call the title off of the prop and just call title. So sometimes you see people circumvent having to call props and props dot by doing what we call destructuring. And then if you're using the data in a string, we can use these backticks in order to, format a string that will also pass in some JavaScript data. It's a little interesting concept of how another way to declare a string in JavaScript. We can also use a function to return some data as inside of a particular component. So in this case, right, this is actually an interesting example because here we have a component, it's called a header, and we have some props, but we also have a regular function called create title, and create title takes in the title and then does some stuff and returns something. But as you can see here, we're calling that function, or they're calling that function inside of this component, this header component's return statement, which is valid. You can always return a function so long as the function returns something, and it'll take the value of the returned function and pass it in as data into your component. In this case, the data is being used to create the title that's inside of the H1, but you can also use a function to return the data to a prop or and pass that in. Ternary operators are a single line if else statement. The way a ternary operator works is you have a conditional statement. So on this side it's saying title. Basically this is saying, hey, is there a title? Does the title exist? Ternary operators use this question mark to kind of separate the conditional statement from the return values. So essentially this is the condition. It says, if this is true, return this, else return this. So kind of funky little syntax, but it's cool because it lets you write one line if else statements. Again, we'll see a lot more of these in the wild as we start hacking on stuff, but just kind of talking you through what you're seeing here in the documentation if you were following along with them there. There's a lot of interesting things that we do with React when it comes to using lists and arrays. If you remember, we can map or use array methods to do do things on arrays. One common thing that you'll see us do often, and we'll talk a lot about in a few lessons, is mapping through a list, right? So taking this array and saying, hey, I have this list of names, and now I want to iterate over this array, like so see every element inside of this array. But instead of just looking at each element, I might want to return an array with each element now turned into some JSX, which is also a valid way for us to create lists of data in a unique way. So let's take a look at that real quick before we move on to our next drawing. And it looks kind of like this, right? Well, if you look at it, I have all of these message components kind of returning. I'm returning this message component a bunch of times, and it's looking really repetitive. When you see things in code are being really repetitive, it's actually kind of a good sign that there might be an easier way or more a clearer or easier to write way to achieve the same thing. In our case, if I want to return, 5 or 6 messages, I can do that even easier if I define if I use an array, right? So let's say I have an array, and I'll just say messages, right? And messages is an array with all my little messages that I have here, right? Yo, what's up? I'm good. How about you? Vibing, teaches some React, you know what I'm saying? Here are the vibes. That's lit. You the best. And whatever that one was, I think it was ITTYL, right? So now I have these messages. This is just an array of strings. Basically what they were doing in that example was taking this array of strings and saying, hey, what if I could turn each of these items in this array into JSX, into a component, right? In order to do that, right? In order to do that, I have to use an array method in order to do that, right? Because I'm inside of a JSX element, I'm inside of this div, and I want to call, if I want to call some JavaScript data, I have to wrap whatever I'm doing in curly braces. So I'll put the curly braces in here. And then what I'm doing now is saying, okay, well, I want to check out every element here. And instead of just returning the string of that element, I want to actually turn that element, this string, into a JSX component. So first thing I want to do is map through the messages array, right? By mapping, I'm going to be able to not only check out each of these items, but I'm going to just return essentially an array that has whatever the new values are that I return. So in this case, what I might want to do is return a JSX, a message for each of these little strings. So to do that, first of all, I need a function to pass into my array. So here I'll actually use an arrow function because it's just a little easier to write. And here I can say, okay, well, inside of this messages array, I'm going to be seeing a different message each time, right? So I might just call what I'm going to pass as data a message. And the message itself will always, as this function, as this map function moves, it'll go from message to message. So every element will now be referenced as message here, right? Which means that what I can do is return a message. Okay, well, this is about to get a little confusing. Let's do this. For every message, right, in all of my messages array, I have some data, right? The data is this, and then it turns into this, and then it turns into this, etc. Right? It keeps going through all of the data in the array. Here, I can return the message component that I made, right, earlier, right? I made a message component, and I had a content prop that I have access to. I can set this prop to be equal to this bit of JavaScript data, like so. And by doing this, now I'm going over this array and saying, hey, for every piece of data inside of this array, return a new message component with the content of that message component being the data of that array. By doing this, right, I can actually get rid of this. Well, this didn't do that the right way, so let's just delete it real quick. And then I'm just gonna add another message here and say, if we see this, it's lit. Save this and go back to our little code. And clearly, as you can see, right, those messages are still rendering, even though I deleted that thing, because we called a JavaScript function in our return statement. This is just me showing you that there's some really cool, complex ways that we can use arrays in order to work with the data that we're seeing inside of our we can use arrays to render other JSX components. And it's very common, just this little syntax you see here of, hey, I have an array, I map through the array and I return a JSX element. It's pretty commonly used design pattern when it comes to the React space. But yeah, y'all, there's one last piece of the puzzle of React that we use. But before we go there, let's go ahead and do this little quick pop quiz. What are props used for in React? A, writing CSS rules. B, passing information to components. Or C, adding attributes to HTML elements. Well, B, we are using props in order to pass information to components. Thank y'all. Thank y'all. You know what I'm saying? I appreciate y'all. I appreciate that. This is up. Yeah, exactly. Right. So dope. So if I want to pass data to a component, I use props. And then The last thing we want to touch on before we slide is how do we connect with and change data inside of a component, right? And we can add interactivity to our sites and change the data inside of our sites using another important React concept called state. So state is a little different than props. Both of them, state and props, are both used when it comes to components. We use props with components, we use state with components. But the difference between props and state is that a component receives data as props, and a component can manipulate and change some data that it has saved with state. Props can't change inside of a component. Like once a component gets some props, it doesn't really change, but state can change. So let's talk about like how we might use state in order to make our app a little bit more dynamic, right? So state typically will come out of changes being done to our site, right? So if we, let's see, what's a good example? I don't have a good example right here, right now. But the idea is, if we think about your tic-tac-toe game, actually, this is actually perfect. This is a segue, right? If you think about your tic-tac-toe game that you built, when you clicked on a particular square, right? You clicked on that square and then the board had to change. We can think about that interaction as an example of the state of our application changing. Essentially, we had the state before the board was clicked, and then when the board got clicked, the state of the board needed to update, right? We needed to change something about how the board was rendered in order to show the actual X or the O or whatever happened at that point in time. Well, in React, you're gonna always still be listening to events. But unlike regular JavaScript, where it was kind of tedious to create what we call event listeners, it actually is super simple to create an event listener and event handler in React, right? If you remember in React and JavaScript, to create an event listener, you have to find the element, add the event listener, add the handler function. It was a lot of different steps. In React, it's just one attribute that you add to a particular element. So let's go here and let's say, let's add an event handling kind of object. So let's say inside of my little messages, I'm gonna add a button. And the reason we use buttons are because buttons are easy elements for a user to understand, hey, I can click this. Well, buttons and other JavaScript, other HTML elements have event handlers on them, right? So there's HTML events. Let's just go real quick. Whoops. There are HTML events that are embedded into our experience on the web, right? So all types of events, things like the page loading or windows changing. We're going to a new tab, right? On forms, right? If you're typing in a form, the form is changing or someone's submitting something. On buttons and other elements, it's clicks and drags and stuff like that, right? There's all types of events that you can listen for in HTML. The good news is all of these events are also passed into JSX. So every JSX element will also be able to use these different events, making sure that those elements have access to those events. One common event is a click, right? Clicks happen on almost any element. You can click on any element on a page and something could happen on that click. Here's the thing you got to keep in mind when you're looking at events in HTML versus JSX and JavaScript. In HTML, you can see that these events have kind of this like all lowercase syntax. In JavaScript and in JSX, these same events exist, but they use camel case syntax. So for us, if we're trying to reference this buttons on click, you can see it's on click with a capital C, camel case, versus in HTML, it's just kind of lowercase on click. So you can use the HTML documentation to see what are the different events you might have access to, but just remember to change the name from lowercase like this to camel case in React. Either way, right? Let's just take a look at what's going on here. So we're talking about, okay, like what happens if we want to do something when the button gets clicked, right? So in order to do something when the button is clicked, right, we first need to say, hey, this button is going to receive on-click handler. And if you're thinking about it from the context of like, well, what's the difference between this on-click thing being defined like this and the props thing we were just talking about? Props are only passed on custom components, so on functions that you create, right? The button here is just a default JavaScript JSX element. So you can't pass props here, but you can define attributes. And these types of attributes are events and style and all those things that we're used to within HTML. Either way, we can handle clicks, no pun intended, by defining the fact that this button will receive a function when it gets clicked, and then creating the function itself, like what's going to happen when that button gets clicked. So in our case, for now, let's just go ahead and just create a new on-click handler. So this JSX element, this button, is going to have an on-click, and the on-click, or like let's say something like save chat. This on-click handler is going to have a function that we can pass into it. So sometimes you'll see people define the functions above the return statement that they're calling. So they say something like handle click, and handle click will be a function that handle click will be a function, and it can return something. Remember that this function is not a component, it's just a regular function. So I don't even have to return something. I just need to do something when this gets called. In this case, what I'll do is I'll just call a simple alert and say saved, right? Here in the on click, I can call that particular function, handle click, right? So when on click gets called, we're actually going to call that handle click method that we just defined, just like so, right? So what I'm going to do is go ahead, save this, and go back to our little code, just make sure it works, and boom. So clicking save chat, you can see this little alert pops up and says save. Great. So how can this help us in the context of using state and adding some differentiations into our code? Well, state is actually a way, will give us the ability to process events and have our page show or respond differently based on data that is passed. We can use what we call hooks in order to maintain the state of our application. Essentially, a hook allows us to say, hey, when we can define the state to be one thing, and when the state is a different thing, we can call this function, this hook, in order to change the state. The hook that we use to keep use of state in React is the React use state hook, which for right now kind of looks like this, right? We use the React library and we use the use state function that's built into the React library to use the state. Use state returns an array, and we can access and use those values of those array values inside of our component using what they call array destructuring. Essentially, the format of how you will see people define the state is like so. There will be a constant with array brackets, and it'll be set to React use state. And this is a little tricky syntax, but it's important to see. I'll just skip to what it actually looks like. Whenever you're going to declare state, there's three things you have to define: the name of the state you're creating, a kind of function that will be called to change that state that you created, and then you set the React use state to the default value of the state itself. So in this case, right, they have kind of a likes situation here. So I can actually change this, and let's say that, like chat or something, right? So in here, I can just say like, basically what they're getting at is with the state, right? Let's say I want to add a counter to how many times this chat has been liked or something, right? Well, what they will say that you can do is define a piece of state, like so. Oops, React.use state and then open. So the two things I need, this is always going to be the syntax you're going to see for using state. The two things you need are the name, the variable name that's going to refer to the state that you're going to be checking. So in this case, it might be likes. A function that I'm going to be able to call, just the name of it, the name of the function that I'll call in order to change the state. And then I need a default value for the state. In this case, the default value is 0 here, right? With this, what I can do is make use of this variable, this likes variable in the set likes function in order to update my code to follow whatever the state is of the likes. So if the likes are 0, I could do something. If the likes are 1, I could do something else. And I use this function set likes to change it from 0 to 1 or to whatever. How this might work is in this case, right? I can say something like, I can add a little, another little element to my code, and I can say likes. So I'll do something like number of likes equals, and then likes, right? So if you remember from earlier, right? I was saying that if I want to pass some JavaScript data into a particular JSX element, I have to use the curly braces, right? So if I want to reference the number inside of likes here, I have to use this curly brace like so in between this JSX element. But what I'm creating here is just a little sentence. This is just a string that says number of likes equals, and then it should show the number of likes in our span. When the button gets clicked, the last thing I want to add is after, instead of making this alert happen, right? Instead of making this alert, what I want to do is I want to call set likes, and I'm going to set it to be likes plus 1. And we'll go back over this on Wednesday. But the idea is now I'm calling this function for setting the likes to change the value from whatever it was previously to something, that same thing plus 1. So let's just save this, go to our code and take a look at what it's looking like right now. So right now it's number of likes is 0, but I can like the chat. And as you can see, the data here is saving and updating in real time, right? Without the page reloading. And that's what state allows us to do, is keep track of data changing in the component so that we can render it on our screen in a unique way. Between these three things, being able to create a component, being able to pass data to a component, and being able to save data internal to a component as state, these three things will give us all the tools we need in order to create complex applications like the ones that we're used to working in. All our goal is now, from now on, is to write these components, build these interfaces, and create the websites that we're used to by using React. So thank y'all for your time and your attention today. I know that this is a lot of different content, but hopefully with the stuff you've just learned, you'll be able to start building out some React sites in no time. So more to come, and we'll talk again soon, y'all. I appreciate y'all. Take care, and I hope everybody